Hello and welcome to Wisconsin Literacy's winter conference session, Building Donor Relationships Best Practices with Julie Riccardi. Thank you to our sponsors for helping make this event available. Wisconsin Literacy, a nonprofit literacy coalition, unites over 80 member agencies across the state to strengthen the power of learning in every community through collaboration, professional development, health, digital, and workforce literacy programs and advocacy. We expand opportunities and build a more equitable, literate Wisconsin. A couple of housekeeping items. This session will be recorded. If you could please keep yourselves on mute for the presentation to help keep down the background noise, that would be really helpful. And please feel free to share your questions in the chat during the presentation, and Julie will be keeping an eye on those. We'll be letting her know as those come up. And now I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker. Julie Riccardi is a seasoned advancement leader with more than 25 years of experience building philanthropic partnerships in education and nonprofit organizations. She currently serves as Vice President for Advancement at Ripon College, where she leads fundraising strategy, alumni engagement, and donor stewardship initiatives. So please join me in welcoming Julie today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. I love that introduction. A little bit more about me. I've been in education for my entire career. I started as a third grade and fifth grade teacher, and so I found my undergraduate degree incredibly helpful as I moved through my career. But those early days started in children's literacy, reading recovery, and so when Ashley reached out to me, I thought, oh, would be very special to come and speak with you. But also because most of my early career, I was really in an office of one, and I do recognize that I had some big umbrellas around me that helped me do my work. But the reality was I was really by myself, if not often trying to implore volunteers to help me with my work. So I hope that my findings over the years and my incredible passion of curiosity around building relationships will help you do your work as well. So we'll get started. I don't know if you have a pen or a paper near you, but I want to ask you a few questions, and I want you to think about your own donor relationship to an organization. It can either be Wisconsin Literacy or really preferably something that you are giving to currently financially. And I want you to jot down a few of these. We won't spend too much time. I don't want you to overthink this, but I want you to think about a cause. So have a cause in your mind, either write it down, put it in your notes on your phone. And then I want you to think about what first connected you to that cause. And the second question, I think, gives you more insight into what that connection was. Was it a moment, a person, an experience that shaped that connection? The third question, I think, takes a little bit more thought, and some of us never take the time to really think about what the causes we are supporting say about us. So think about that cause you're thinking about, and I want you to think of a word or a phrase. What is this saying about you as you support the cause? And that might be hard to think about right now, but if you can, write something down. When you support this cause, do you feel more connected to people, to purpose, or to something bigger than yourself? We'll come back to these points throughout this presentation. The next question: has someone from the organization you chose contacted you personally? That's a yes or no. If someone from that organization has reached out to you, What about that contact made you feel seen and made you feel understood? One of the reasons I wanted to start off with us thinking about our own personal philanthropy and connection to an organization is that over the course of the last 30 years and raising money, both for some nonprofits in my communities that I've been in, and I've been in a volunteer space, but also with the institutions that I've worked and that I've left. I often do think back on what it said about me, how I thought about my own philanthropy, and some of the very questions I was asking the donors I was working with, had I ever reflected on them for my own personal giving and volunteering. And I think it's important for each of us, if we want to do this work, we have to understand what drives our own philanthropy. Not that we at all are the mean, because we cannot speak for the legions of people that are supporting our organizations, but it does help us understand motivation and then understand a little bit of our audience. This next slide I want to hit on, you've probably seen the highlights, whether you look at social media, read paper, etc., hear podcasts, but the epidemic of loneliness in our society. And I've been studying the concept of donor relations and developing relationships for almost 25 years. In fact, I did my master thesis on this topic and the decision making that comes in philanthropy around a donor relationship. And the thing that has struck me in the last few years is that I've been thinking about belonging and donor fundraising for 25 years. And now we're watching a lot of information and research come out on divide, really, post-pandemic, but even during the pandemic, it became heightened. And we were really focused on the loneliness of some of our elders and then our youngest population. I want us to think a little bit too about how does this impact people connecting to our organizations. Right now, we know that 50% of adults do report loneliness. We know that that is heightened with the male, those who identify as male in our population actually report an inability to find community and find friends. We know that civic participation is declining. We also know that because of the Giving USA reporting that has kind of happened specifically around the decline of attendance in worship, regardless of the denomination religion, because that was for many decades a source of connectivity. And then we also know that the connection and volunteering certainly increase philanthropic interest and increase giving. And so if we think about those things together, if we were to look at a graph, if we have reported of heightened loneliness, participation is declining, and we know with our donor and in education, just so you have a reference from me, we talk about alumni engagement scores. We keep track of these kinds of things, and it's very transferable in our other nonprofit organizations. If someone's showing up to take the trash out twice a week, and someone's writing thank you notes, and then someone's making their gift annually, they might have a little higher score, which would indicate on the surface that they're a little bit more deeply connected with our organization. And we know that those connections result in sustained giving and increased giving. And so I want us to start to think about how do we engage people a little bit differently, particularly if we know that they have a hard time getting to us to begin with, if that makes sense. I took this picture off your website because I loved it, first of all, because it was such a dynamic picture, and I don't know these people. And yet, there's a story just visually in this picture. I can only assume that the two people on the outside of this person in a graduate gear holding a baby have probably been supporting this person through literacy. That would be my guess. You see an intergenerational play here because you've got at least 3 generations of people who are taking literacy seriously. And I thought this really speaks to the next topic that I think is so intimately woven into the work we do, and that is trust. So you have already a space where people aren't wanting to approach necessarily, but want desperately to feel connected. And then they often have to ask themselves, well, how do I trust that if I make a donation to this place, that I know that it's being used exactly the way I intended it to be used, and that that organization cares about what I care about. And then we also know, because of research, trust happens when we act consistently. We are sharing a lot of information. That word transparency, I think, just boils down to sharing consistent messaging around where we are in the organization. And unfortunately, transparency has become kind of a buzzword, I think, just because of the lack of consistent sharing around how well or what's happening in our organizations. And then at the bottom of this, in research, we always come back to personal connection. So I want to start with going back to your questions for a minute. I was thinking about an organization that I was involved with, and one of those first questions was, what is the organization? And how have you been involved? And did anybody ever contact you? And what drove you to give to that organization? And if you want, you could put in the chat what drove you, what connected you. Was it a person? Was it a moment? Was it the mission? But my guess is you didn't write down, gosh, they had a compelling annual report. And when I saw that annual report, I thought, you know what I want to do? I don't know anything about Wisconsin literacy, but I really want to get involved. I don't think anybody's ever said that. I have never said that, and I love annual reports. But you probably did write about a moment or a person or a connection. The organization I want to tell you about is I moved to North Carolina. I had worked at Purdue University for quite a long time, and one of the ensembles that I helped raise money for was the bell choir. And little did I realize that I was moving to the mecca of one of the best bell choir, professional bell choirs in the country, called the Raleigh Ringers. And also did not know that a former student of mine had moved to that area. And I get a call one day, and Angela says, Julie, would you ever consider being on the board of the Raleigh Ringers? And I cannot say no. So that's one of my personal challenges. But two, I love music. And so I said, well, tell me a little bit about it. And as the more Angela went on, she said, we're a very small organization. We are run purely by alumni of the choir, the bell choir, and current memberships. And we're coming upon our 30th anniversary, and we've really never had a solicitation. We're running out of money. The state's no longer funding us, and we know you fundraise. Would you at least help us with an outline? And so, of course, I said, sure, I'm going to do this. Can you guess why I said yes ultimately? And I know there's really no way to go back and forth. But if already you're hearing some of my slides, you might recognize that the reason I said yes was because of Angela. I've never played a bell in my life. I probably wouldn't be able to play a bell if I tried. But because I knew Angela and because she gave me a compelling reason and I had known her as a student, I almost felt a little bit obligated to say yes to her because I also wanted to help. And so rather than this transactional ask of calling me, I wasn't a stranger. She knew me. She didn't know me well, and she didn't actually know where I was in my career or my volunteer space at that point. But that conversation became very relational instead of transactional. And it also came with a very personal endorsement from her. She was asking me because she knew she needed help and she knew I had a skill set. And so, in a way, we might say she wore me down a little bit, but the reality was it was a person to person ask. My answer could have been no, and I think she would have reacted to that. But it gave me a place to feel connected. And oh, by the way, I was new to Raleigh. So I didn't really know that many people. I loved this concept of how do we get connected? And oftentimes it isn't going to be picking up that annual report on somebody's coffee table or responding to an ad. It's the fact that someone took the time to call me. And I'll even go as far to say sometimes we don't even know those people, but the fact that they gave me the opportunity to hear their request was all that it took for me. I've been thinking a lot about this concept recently because there was also a woman, and I'll call her Mary Jo. This is not her real name. And she was in her 90s. And in a small area like Raleigh, probably like in the areas you are, many of the nonprofit leaders know one another. And over time, you deal with some of the very same people supporting multiple organizations. And one day I was at a Association of Fundraising Professionals meeting, and Mary Jo's name came up. And we all sort of started talking and lamenting a little bit about the fact that Mary Jo had promised all of us that she would talk to us about a gift of a lifetime, a transformational gift to these three organizations. And we'd been meeting with her over and over and over again. And one day, I got this epiphany that Mary Jo had outlived all of her friends. Mary Jo had these three organizations that she was very active in. She would always come and help. And I thought, this is her way to connect. This is the place, these are the places she feels that she belongs. And so it really opened my mind, and I hope it will help you keep in the back of your mind that oftentimes, if we know that people are lonely, if we know that they want to feel connected and they get connected to our organization, that sometimes we become far more than just the nonprofit with the mission to propel literacy in our communities. We become a place where our volunteers and our donors also build connection, they build a community, and they become people who help us bring others in where they can belong. On the left, I've started this about 25 years ago, where no matter where I was, and it's a little bit of a homage to my mother who took video with the big video, it was on your shoulder. That's how big video machines were back in the 80s and 90s. She took pictures of everything, and she passed away about 15 years ago. And I've thought over time how special it has been for me to not only take pictures with alumni, donors, et cetera, that I meet, but to send them back to them. And I want to start to begin to hit on a little bit of another concept that we should talk about today in terms of building relationship with our donors. The middle picture, if anybody can even see that, is a picture of cross stitch needlepoint. I do not have the eyes for needlepoint, but several of my donors in my last organization were doing needlepoint, and it became a conversation starter for me to learn more about, but also to get a little bit more insight into things that were important to them and the way they spent their time and how they made impacts on their family and friends via needlepoint. So I put the pictures throughout this presentation to remind you that one of the things that we have to think about when we're talking about how do we engage more deeply, that we have to be very thoughtful and careful that we spend our time and we focus in on the things that will actually bring a larger benefit to our organization. When I got into fundraising a long time ago, events were very popular, and they do remain popular and a way to connect people. But there was something that shifted in my mindset about 20 years ago, and it was after reading several papers from the Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy. At that time, they were talking about the ROI, the return on investment for our events. And I had an incredible event. I had 1,000 people coming in for this event in the fall. And after reading those papers, I went back and started to actually do the work of decoupling the feelings that we had about the events, the excitement for the event, and actually what I might be missing because I was spending so much time working on the event that I was missing the opportunity to actually have strategic conversations with the donors that were coming to the event. The second thing I think that we spend quite a bit of time on and focus on are our appeals. And that is so important. And yet, at the end of the day, there's nothing that replaces someone making a personal contact with you. It's good, and you do need to have them, and they should be a part of your infrastructure, but they can't be the only thing that you can rely on. And then three, I think nowadays we would all agree that if we are not in a social space, in those social posts, that we feel that we're not connecting. But I would ask, and we'll do a little bit of this talk in a few minutes in another slide on metrics, being really mindful of how much energy we put into these three components and then how much energy we're putting into the bottom four, because this is actually where our cost-effective strategies actually are born. How are we thanking those who are giving to us? I asked you a question at the top of this meeting. When was or has anyone from the organization that you're giving to contacted you personally? And if we were all live, I'd love to see a show of hands to see, have you been contacted personally? And if not, how does that make you feel? Just recently, I was giving back to a few organizations. And of course, I mentioned I went to Purdue. Purdue, I think at this point, has close to 50,000 undergraduate students. When I was there, it was 38,000. And I was fully aware that I was a number. And yet, I worked there for an additional 10 years, raised money in a department, and most recently made a gift in December. I did not get a thank you note until last week. And when I got that thank you note, there was nothing written on it. Nothing. In fact, the signature of the director, who I have gotten to know personally, was a rubber stamp. And I went back to my third grade teaching mindset and thought, I am sure that they are inundated with a number of thank you notes that they need to write. And I was a number at Purdue, and so I can actually adjust to that. But the reality is that if that person would have personally thanked me or even written the word thank you, I would have thought, oh, that person saw my letter and they wanted to make the time. And I'm a fundraiser. So I can give the grace, but I did take the time to actually go back to that person as I'm getting to know and volunteer there and say, this is a very small tweak that you could make that would make a huge difference. And we know that if you are connecting personally, even with that personal note, that the likelihood of me coming back and increasing my giving over time goes up by 15 to 20%. So I think it's important to make sure, if we are really focused on the top 3 events, appeals, and social media posts, or any other thing, you put it in, whatever your organization believes, I would tell you that making sure you're thanking people better, that you are spending the time to manage your time, to report better, to call or text, or now I call it the trifecta. I do all of those things multiple times, is far better spent than any one of these events. Now, I don't want you to, with reckless abandon, give away your auction that brings in the most money every year. But I do want you to think about the law of diminishing returns. And if you really feel like you are maximizing and you're still able to do these things, then you're right on target. But if you are a small shop and you do believe that you are leaving what we might say as gifts that are not being realized, ask yourself, how often are you writing that person? How often are you sharing stories personally around the organization or sharing numbers? And then how often are you trying to get in touch with those people personally? And then are you actually listening, which we'll get to in a minute. One of the questions in the chat is, I periodically write short thank yous at the bottom of a thank you letter, and is this appropriate space for this? And I would say 100%. If you're doing that, I would try to see how much more you can do it versus periodically. And then the next thing I would say is, once you become accustomed to doing that, figure out how much time it takes you. I had a wonderful volunteer once who did assembly line work, and she changed my entire life because she saw me sitting with a pile of 300 letters. And she said, are you signing all of those personally and writing notes? And I said, yes, and it's taking me forever. And she said, have you ever taken time to sit down and write maybe 10, 20 little signature notes that you can have by season? And I said, no, I've never done that. And she said, well, let's do it right now. So we did it. I still have it I keep it in my desk, and I pull it out occasionally when I just can't, something doesn't come to me. They're seasonal. I've actually changed them over time. I worked at an all-girls boarding school. I changed them to be more in the flavor of the mission by season. We had some catchphrases, like I'm sure we all do, that I added in. But those helped me so that I did not use that as an excuse as to why I couldn't. The other thing that this volunteer told me, which has forever changed, is how we have our envelopes set up, how we fold our letters, are just part of the expediting. And I still do this to this day, even though I do have a little bit of a larger team. I've said I can do up to 300 letters with a handwritten note and my signature if I have 3 hours of time where no one interrupts me. Those are really important things for you to figure out for yourself. How long does it take you? Can you only do 100 before your handwriting gets, unreadable, illegible? But understand those things so that you utilize your time wisely. And then once you get into the habit of doing that, that becomes so routine to those donors, then you've got to find that next thing to elevate. So what does that become? Does it become a text? Does it become a quick postcard? I had a colleague who had postcards made, and when she would, and actually sometimes she would hear about these things, these touch points, and other times she would create them. I had a donor who we'll call Susie, and she was very into art, not my bailiwick, but I would purposely go out and find an article, and then I would write Susie a postcard and say, "Oh, I saw this on XYZ today in the New York Times." That wasn't something I was seeking to do, but then you've got economies of scale where there were so many people like Susie that I could almost write the same thing and get into a rhythm. And then that was my secondary touch point. We've all heard that this, um, if you, and I think this is very old information now with social media because of the latest statistic I have heard is someone needs 20 to 50 touch points before they will purchase the thing from the loft. They will buy the thing from Target. That's a far cry from the 7 to 9 touches in 3 different types of media than we know. But it does mean if we have consistent, relatable touches, that we will build a relationship, but they have to be meaningful.
Julie, there's
Two.
a couple of comments in the chat. The first one is a question. I periodically write short thanks at the bottom of a thank you letter. Is this an appropriate space for this?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And then the second one, people have to care about you like
Yes.
you would care about a friend, and then they're willing to support you. That is 100%. So caring about you is just as about caring about the organization. And that's really what these touch points are truly about. It's listening. So when I'm with people, and in a slide or two, I'll share some questions that I typically go through. And on the last slide, I've given some resources. Bloomerang recently came out with the top 40 things that you should go through with a donor conversation. I liked a lot of them, and I do a lot of them. You may have your own, but I would also encourage you to sit down and make sure you you do have 20 or 30 questions that you're constantly thinking about whenever you are around anyone, and you find the opportunities instead of waiting for the opportunities and the door to open for you. It is about how many times we meaningfully collect, and if you connect, and if you're constantly asking for money, if you're constantly asking for support, there's no way for you to actually understand why the person is attached to your mission. And then thinking about, I love these points at the bottom, which is something I've been talking to my own team about, making sure we're paying attention to the last time we had two-way interaction. Now, and then I think it's a slide or two. I also give you a couple of ideas on workflow, free workflow, things that you can, if you're not in Google or you're not using Mojo or things like that, that can help you because this is a lot to manage. And I know if you're one or two or three, it's overwhelming if you don't have those platforms and CRMs to help you even manage the level of connectivity you need to have. But it really does go to the point in the chat, how well do I know my donors? And then how well will they start to know me? I'm doing a review of our endowments here, 305 endowments, and I've gotten through 200. It's amazing to me how much one-way documentation we have. So nothing immaterial is happening in our endowment, but it's alarming to me the lack of two-way communication. And how long do you allow the two-way communication to happen? How many emails do I send asking for something before I pick up the phone? And then because people don't pick up their phones anymore, when do I text? And if they don't text me back, when do I actually just write a handwritten note? And at what time do I create a narrative around why they might not be getting back to me? And I would suggest that you must not create a narrative. So many times, if I allow my brain to go to the narrative, well, they're not interested. The reality is, once I actually am in contact with them because I've been consistent in trying to signal that I want to meet with them, they disclose, oh gosh, I was gone for 2 weeks, or I was needing to take care of my mother, or my son just had a crazy wild time of year. It's never what I think, but if I'm consistent, um, silence does not always signal a total disengagement. It might signal a life event, significant to us or otherwise. We may not be able to judge that. But silence often does signal something, and it should signal to us to keep going instead of waiting back and waiting for them to respond. Because we also know that silence eventually becomes disengagement. Behavioral change, we were just talking about this morning on our team meeting. Someone was saying, well, they usually come to this event every year and they weren't there. And I said, okay, did you call them? No. Okay, so let's call them. If they don't answer, let's call them again. Let's do the trifecta and let's make sure it's over the course of a short amount of time and put it on your calendar so that you don't forget. Because how many people do you need to do that with? Probably hundreds, if not thousands, right? And then, like I've already mentioned, giving behavior typically does fall into very predictable life cycles. And so we do have to pay attention to those and make sure that we aren't creating a narrative, but rather making sure we're anticipating. If I know that this person is probably retiring soon, I may actually want to have an intentional conversation with them around, well, what will you be doing next? And how should I be in touch with you? This slide to me is incredible. When I got to 2 positions ago, I was meeting with the team and we were talking. And I started by saying, why don't you give me a list? Let's go through the top 25 people who've been engaged for 10 years or more, giving at the top level. And I asked these questions, and the team at large didn't know these answers. And this is a very sophisticated operation at a very, very large institution with no need for budget worries or anything. I say that because we can be a party of one, or we can have an entire team with every safety net around. And yet, if we are not connecting, if we have not asked important life questions whenever we have the opportunity to be together, if we do not understand what they love in their life, who their family is, and why they care about our organization, then nothing else matters, because if they go silent, we won't be able to reconnect. A great story recently, I was with a young fundraiser and we went to visit with someone. And in the course of the meeting, the gentleman said something about a grandson. And I said, oh, you have grandchildren. How many grandchildren do you have? And he went on to tell me. I said, oh, well, how many children do you have? And went on to tell me. And then they were talking about a trip they were taking and what he read next. At the end of that, I debriefed with the person. And the individual said, I didn't even know he had children. And I said, and he'd been very successful with this donor. And I said, wow, how often have you met with that person? And he said, not very much. And I said, well, then how did you help them close their gift? And how did you stay connected? And he said, it was all through email. I said, well, should be a good reminder that you can actually accomplish a lot. I mean, we did it for centuries. We wrote each other letters. Pigeons delivered them sometimes. People brought them by horseback. So deep relationships can happen in a lot of ways. However, it matters what you're thinking about when you're with that person. And I want to remind you that no matter how many people you have in your organization, that yes, absolutely, Zach, people love being asked about themselves, and we like to talk about ourselves. But more importantly, when we ask important questions, oftentimes we might be the only person that individual feels comfortable with talking to us about their finances, about where they're giving, and we become this cone of trust for them. It's always been fascinating to me how quickly trust can be built and how quickly trust can be destroyed. So we have this power within our abilities in philanthropy to build trust and have people talk to us, which is why I believe you must engage in those important questions when you are with donors. If you are not engaging those questions, they will go somewhere else. This is Tamina. She is a surgeon in beautiful Alabama. And one of the most meaningful touch points that I've ever had with her was talking about her passions. And she also loves to create incredible meals that she brings family and friends in. That's her outlet. Had nothing to do with her organization, had nothing to do with her philanthropy, but it was something she loved. And so there are other times where we can invest in our donors' passions and ways. And I'm not saying go buy a table at the Met Gala because someone is going and you need to be there. What I am saying is if they have an art show and you can, show up. And if you can't, write them a note. Those things you'll only know about them if you're connecting with them on a deeper level. Tamina, I happened to ask her if she would come and do a little demo during one of our weekends where we had donors in, and it was so much fun because you could see everyone else in the room. This had nothing to do with what we were fundraising for at all, but it humanized everybody in that room, and they were talking about things that they were doing outside of this. Remember those early slides I was talking about? Sometimes our nonprofit becomes the place for connection and the place for belonging. And people want to find people that they have things in common with. So literacy may be just the starting point, but if you'll even connect people with each other, even if there are no ways for them to meet. And I'm saying, well, you know what? I was just with Marcia the other day, and you may not know her, but she has been involved forever. You would really love her. I hope the next time we have a gathering, you might be able to connect. I'd love to introduce you. It tells me not only are you thinking about me in a different way outside of our regular time together, but you do care about connecting me. Meaningful touch points that are so easy, and I was just telling a volunteer about this the other day. Holidays, birthdays. I told you already about articles. I snap a photo whether I look great in it or not. I do not care. And I always get that to them. It is pennies to go to CVS, and I know that this is a idea from 1984, but I will tell you, even though no one ever uses frames anymore and everything is digital, there is nothing like writing a note after you've just taken a selfie with someone and sending it to them. Also, because people don't get personal mail much anymore. Holidays, I would often say, go get those cards on the holidays where you know that people are usually disconnected. I just saw a meme the other day and then a TikTok video about I wish it was 1979 and I got 30 Valentines from people who were forced to give them to me. I have often gone to Target at the end of a season and bought as many Office or Snoopy Valentines as I can and just write little notes. It's not that you have to be elaborate. It's that I want Emma Thompson, if you're listening, I saw your name earlier and I thought, boy, I hope it's the movie star that came to this session. I just want you to know I'm thinking about you. The workflows that I was telling you about, I think part of the hardest part about the work we do is just making sure we're organized, and our time management is of the utmost importance in the work we do, because there's no way that we can do all of these meaningful touch points unless we have workflows that work. And so I list these. If you haven't used Trello or To-Do List, or you don't use your Google Space or don't have a platform, they do offer free or very low cost solutions to that. And I often find if I don't put things in my calendar immediately after I've finished, then I will forget and I'll think, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. I was just talking to one of my professors yesterday, and I was telling her I was going to come speak to you. And I said, I'm going to tell my Bill Burner story. Bill Burner was a faculty member, and back in the old days, we would go to a faculty dinner once a month where we had to dress up and wear heels and hose. That was a big deal. And then I went back to work at Purdue, and Bill was retired. And I loved Bill. He was a wonderful mentor, incredible donor to our organization, but gave me a lot of great insights. And one day I got a call from Bill, and he said, Julie, I haven't seen you for a while. And as he's talking, I'm looking through my calendar because I'm thinking, of course I've seen you, Bill. What are you talking about? And I keep going through my calendar, and realize it's been an entire year. I haven't picked up the phone. I haven't run into Bill Burner. I have made no effort to get to know him or, get back with him. And immediately felt this pit in my stomach thinking, Bill has been one of my most loyal people. And unless I own the fact that I put it on autopilot and did not schedule it, I have now spent a year without a really deep connection with him. Now, he forgave me, and we were able, because that Speed of Trust, if you've not read that book, very quick to regain trust if you can be back in the game very quickly and authentically. And so I'm grateful to Bill, but it was a really big wake-up call for me to put those little things on my calendar. My calendar looks like a highlighter's dream, but it's because if I run into someone and have that conversation a month out, I put a tickler on my calendar to just drop them a note about something. And oftentimes now, because I'm in my mid 50s, I have to even remind myself, what should I write the note about, or why should I call? The other thing I would encourage you to do is do not convince yourself you don't have the time or you can't make the time once or twice a week to have a few hours to reach out to those individuals. Here's another myth I have told myself over the years that I have retrained and reframed my brain on. Most of the time, we know if I sat down and called and wrote and texted people for 3 hours, the likelihood of all of those people responding to me within the hour to say, yes, I'd love to meet you on Tuesday, is very close to none. I think that's a myth that I've heard my colleagues at big, small, all over the place. Well, I don't want to have too many requests out there for visits because what if they all come back at the same time? They will never come back at the same time. And if they do, you can call me back and say, well, you were wrong. And I hope that that happens. But the truth is, those are one of many pieces of repetition that you will have to have. So I encourage you to really think about your time management and are you spending what percentage of your time during your week are you spending putting those feelers out in those touch points? I also have thought over the years the biggest distraction I ever have is in the workplace. So taking myself out of the space that I am most comfortable in and prone to a water cooler conversation is all the difference in the world. These are not the only strategic questions I go over with, but usually when I make an investment to reach out to someone, I'm very clear about why I want to come and talk to them. And I try very hard in the very first two meetings to not talk about a gift, partly because I want a person to feel comfortable with me, partly because as much as I am an extrovert, I'm an introvert, and I really like quiet conversations, and I want to get to know the people that I'm with. Oftentimes, I'm working with people that don't have exuberance and that really need me to draw out of them the conversation. And so I often start with things like, well, tell me where you were born. Tell me where you grew up. And again, I mentioned earlier, I have a list of 20, 25 questions I always have for networking, for cocktail parties. Most of the time I will ask them, and someone said this in the chat, if you can get someone talking about themselves, they'll tell you more than they realize they're telling you. We all do that. If someone will get us talking about ourselves or what our passions are, we disclose far more than we ever believed we were disclosing. Ask someone, how did you get? What was your trajectory? You were here when you came into the organization and started participating. Why? I was just in Florida last week visiting with donors, and it was amazing to me how shocked they were when I would say, do you realize you've been giving for 17 years consecutively? I can't believe it's amazing. Does that make you feel good? And I just sat and let silence fill the space for a minute and let it sink into them that one, I knew that I had looked it up and I was prepared to talk about it. Two, to say thank you. And then a few times this last week, I also said, and I'm curious why you haven't given the last 2 years, and would you be willing to share that with me? Because I'd love to know what we could do differently and where we've fallen short, or has something changed in your life? And again, just like that quietness of when we ask someone for something, give them the space to think about it. One gentleman said to me, no one's ever come to see me. And I said, well, I am so sorry about that, but I'm here now. And he said, well, you are. And my wife told me I should double my giving. And I said, well, great. I love your wife already. These things feel, I think, to some of us at different points in our careers, very uncomfortable to talk about. But I want to give you the permission to talk about these things with donors in a gentle, caring, thoughtful way, because I believe 9 out of 10 times in my experience over the last 25, 30 years, that if I can get to the meeting with that person, this might be the only time in their life they've ever had these kind of conversations, and they are longing to have them. I was with a board member a month ago, and we were talking about a scholarship she wanted to start in honor of her father. And had I allowed my own narrative in my mind to play out, I would not have asked her if she knew about a distribution that she needs to take probably in a year or two. But I said to her, do you know that you can take a distribution instead of taking this out of your savings? And she said, no, I don't know anything about that. I said, well, I don't know the most about it, but if you want to talk about it, I can get you more information. Now, did I know the most? Of course I did. I came completely prepared. But when she was vulnerable with me, I decided I should meet her where she was, which also gave me a chance to follow up with her. That was now a month ago. She just wrote me this morning. She said, I've been thinking about everything you asked me to think about, and I'm ready to talk to you now. So open those doors, because I think in a way, sometimes our donors won't bring that up to us, but they'll signal very quickly for us if they don't like our approach or if they don't like the question or if they feel comfortable. And I have often said, and my mother was a therapist, but a bereavement therapist, it's that time where we feel like we can just go, I can ask anything I want. I'm not going to feel silly asking. I feel like I can trust the person that's coming to see me. Um, and then you can really start to ask more deeply held questions like, what's the best philanthropic decision you've ever made and why? And understand a little bit of their psyche around what is the gift that they thought meant the most to them. You may be surprised, because sometimes it's not the largest gift, but usually it is the most meaningful because of the way it made them feel. I always try to ask within the first 3 times I'm with someone, what are your philanthropic interests? Where do you give? What makes you feel good? Why are those your top 3? And I usually say top 3 because I really want them to think about, I pray that one of them is my organization. If not, definitely gives me an idea where we fall and why. And sometimes I might even follow up with, well, what you've been giving to us, why aren't we in the top 3? And then usually they're pretty open and are helpful in helping me realize where we need to shore up some of the things we are doing or not doing. Last question that I put on here, which I think has been really helpful over the years, is to also ask that person to think about someone else that they would recommend I connect with. This came up recently. I mentioned I'm at a college, and so most of my donors are naturally with the college. And I was speaking with an alum, and she said, I have a group of women who are not engaged. They do have resources. They have no families and no children, and they're really looking to get active. And I really feel like they might want to make an investment with us. And I said, well, over the years, I've found that that's really interesting, because sometimes they don't have a natural space to go, or they haven't been volunteering, or they haven't had anybody to talk to. So it is a good question to say, do you know anyone else that you think you might invite in to this? And might we have coffee or tea and just get to know each other? I'm working with someone, there's a community very close to us on a beautiful, beautiful lake. So most of those people have nothing to do with the college, but they participate in some of the arts programs. They often come to football games, and I think they like knowing that they have this little college collegiate bedroom community. And so one of our coaches put me into contact with 2 individuals on the lake. And I said, I'd just love to meet. I would just love to see what you think of the community, of our school. And in that first meeting over pizza, they said, we love the school, but we don't want you to ask us for money. And I said, oh, okay. I'm thinking, well, first meeting, pass me another piece of pizza. I said, well, could I ask why? And they said, because everyone asks us for money. What we'd like to do is see if we could contribute in other ways. And I thought, thank goodness they were upfront and open. I have started texting with all of those people. This isn't their home base. They come here periodically. Just creating spaces for me to connect. We talked about the fact that they play tennis, what they were reading, where they were going. This has had nothing to do with Ripon College so far. And they know what I do. But I'm trying to create a relationship so that if and when there is a space, and that takes me very little time, that there might be an opening, and then there might be a space for me to ask, but I'm also asking for their expertise. I want to get in a little bit to metrics. I don't know if you think about metrics in your own shop, big or large, smaller, large, I should have said rather. I do think if we are not on a weekly basis connecting with 30 to 50 people or making 30 to 50 connections, we are not going to move the dial in our organizations. So it is important to remember that if that's not happening, you can do all the events in the world. You can do all of the mailings that are variable data that are impersonal, but if you are not reaching out, even if the person isn't reaching back out to you, you will not move the dial. Remember that statistic, that personal reach out can increase someone's lifetime giving 15 to 20%. I also think it's really important that we think about donor retention. And that's even more of a reason, which just means contact, 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 which seems overwhelming. But if we are able to retain those donors over time, the only way we'll do that is if we know them personally. And a few slides ago, you saw that very first line was, if you haven't been in touch with that person or you don't know why they haven't been in touch with you, that has to be on a little post-it by your computer every day that you look at and say, if I haven't been in touch with them, why? If they haven't been in touch with me, why? When you really become donor-centered, Penelope Burke wrote an incredible book now about 10, 15 years ago called Donor-Centered Fundraising. And she was revolutionary to the fundraising I was doing because at that point it was very, really metric based, but very transactional. And I started to realize that if I was counting all of the things that I was doing, that 10 times for me to outreach with a variable data letter actually wasn't 10 connection points. It could have been one. And I needed to make sure I was doing other things. Jerry Panis, who is no longer with us, he wrote a book, a wonderful book, short read. You can have it with a glass of probably anything, milk, tea, wine. It'll take you about an hour to read, and it's called The Art of the Ask. And he really gets to the heart of that interrelational fundraising, and it is all about connection. And so if there's anything I can say towards the end of this program, that if you are not taking a look at how you are spending, I won't say you're 24 hours a day, but those 7 to 8 hours every day, and being very intentional that you are not losing that time or making sure that time is invested in important ways to bring benefit back to ultimately philanthropy, then you should really start to think about shifting that focus a little bit. I know we have time for a few questions, if you have any.
And people can either unmute or put them in the chat. This has been wonderful, Julie. Thank you.
Just fantastic. Well, I can jump in with a question. I'm curious, Julie, do you think organizations are, and I'm not sure if this is a black and white yes or no question, just curious your thoughts on this. Is it better for organizations to pursue fewer donors and, larger gifts, or is it, maybe better to reach out to lots of folks, $25 here, $30 here? I'm curious if you think one approach is better or it's a nuanced question, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
It is nuanced. I think it's all of the above because you want a larger base and a larger constituency to build towards that major gift fundraising. And we often talk about our annual donors. If they are consistently giving you $50 a year and you haven't reached out to them, they'll never become that next large, whatever your organization believes or your area believes is the large gift. That could be $1,000, $5,000, $25,000. You do have to have the base. And I've been talking a lot about the wealth transfer. You've all been reading about that, no doubt. I don't even know what the number would be. Trillions, it's probably bigger than trillions now that will happen in the next decade. Once that money is transferred, we have an entire group of individuals who actually do not have the baby boomer philanthropic mindset. And so they will have to be engaged. The baby
Mhm.
boomer mindset, we know if you've read anything about that, is I give out of obligation, I give out of um, sheer because I'm supposed to. We've got an entire group my age between 50s and 70s right now who are not in that space. And then we've got the 50s on down who we've seen the group GoFundMe's, we've seen that passionate. I want to see it working. So that's why I feel like you do have to have a large base. And then this, the devil is in the details. It's making sure you are so organized that you have the ability to keep those people who are giving 50 feeling engaged, feeling like you know them. Penelope Burke says the old adage that you only spend and make accessible to the top executives, your top donors, is not correct because you're building relationships at every level. So don't forget that $25 today could very easily be in just a few years. Sometimes that's what we call a gateway gift. I'm just dipping my toe in this. I'm trying to see, are you
Mhm.
paying attention to me? Now, sometimes that's all that person has and will ever give you. But I would say, think about what it would take to replace that donor. And I think sometimes we don't think about that. Attrition
Mhm.
is more deadly to an organization than trying to be organized and work on maintaining donors. So I'm sorry
There's
to
a
say it's all of them. You have to work on everybody.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat from Lily. I often hear that the potential donor needs to be aligned with our mission. Should this be one of the top considerations for approaching an individual? And how would I know that? Is my rest of
You
that
know,
question.
we hear that all the time. In fact, I've got a friend who was telling me the other day, she said, I just don't know if this person I'm going to is even aligned with what we're doing in the medical school. And I said, well, have you talked to them? She said, no. I said, well, go talk to them. And I said,
Mhm.
part of our work is also bringing someone who has a passion for philanthropy into our space. And then sometimes we negotiate. You negotiate passion, you negotiate help. You will find as you work through those meetings with those individuals, whether that's a one-time gift, an injection into your group, or whether it's a sustainable, repeatable gift. And honestly, we need them all, right? I've had donors that were very clear. I will do this for you once. I hope that it helps. And then I usually say, I promise that I will not ask you again until you tell me if you're ever ready again. But I often say too, I don't often say it, I always say it, but I won't stop calling you. Partly because if I've worked with a donor at that level, I kind of like them too, right? I've gotten to
Mhm.
know them a little bit. So I promise you I won't stop talking to you.
That's great. I want to piggyback on something that you were talking about right before this, and that was the different ages of donors. And is there, and I keep hearing this, but I guess I just don't know the answer. Does each different age group of donors, the boomers who are on their way out and the millennials, is there a different way to approach each of those age groups? Is there a science?
Well, we talk about the science and the art of fundraising.
Mhm.
I think once upon a time there was definitely a science to everything we did. I've watched, and maybe you all have watched too, over the course of the last decade, the science has a little bit gone out the window and the art is there. I have donors that are 90 in their 90s who want to see the return on their investment and they want to have a report. I also see people in their 20s and 30s who are having wonderful careers who just want to help and don't want to be bogged down with all the things. And they're like, I'll just give this to you, leave me alone. So in fact, I have a little sweet 98-year-old who has a copper pipe company. And she said, why don't you ever write me a letter asking me to donate copper piping? And I said, you're the cutest 98-year-old millennial I ever met. Um, we don't have that kind of variable data in our system, but I think that's of joy though, right? Like in my early career, if you didn't follow this hierarchy, you would have never texted someone. You would
Mhm.
have never. Now, it's amazing to me. I put in one of the slides Calendly. If you have not used Calendly, even the free version, it's brilliant. And I'll email people and it's attached to my calendar and I populate the times I'm open. Amazing how many people will sign up for a meeting with me, no matter the age. They'll do it virtually. and not all the 92,000 back and forth. Like, well, what about
Yeah,
Wednesday? What about Thursday?
right.
And it doesn't matter the age. So to me, that's kind of a gift in and of itself that some of these things are, we are in such a unique place in the universe right now where you can be any age, doesn't matter. Now, I do think some of the, you do need to be aware of styles. You need to be aware of how
Mhm.
people process, um, because you get those hints very quickly if you're listening. And then you quickly can put them into a category. But initially, assuming just because I've got a 98-year-old that they're not right with it and texting me, that's
Mhm.
out the window now.
That's great.
Is
Thank
anybody
you.
else having that experience, by the way? I mean, I think it's phenomenal that people
Mhm.
want to do all those different ways of connecting. I wish they weren't. I used to say, gosh, I wish we could give up one thing. And so I think we did. The fax machines went away. So, and then everything else kind of came in.
It's true.
But you guys don't even know what a fax machine is. How do
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. We really appreciate your time. I know we're at the end of our session here, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you so much for your insight, for your knowledge. I think all of us will walk away with several takeaways. At least I know that I will. So, thank you all for attending the session entitled Building Donor Relationships Best Practices.